Welcome to Lesson 5, Regulations. Now, from your VFR experience, you've already learned that for the sake of safety, certain rules must be followed. Those rules are called Visual Flight Rules, or VFR. Well, you guessed it, IFR operation, again for the safety of all participants, require you to follow instrument flight rules, hence the term IFR. In this lesson, we'll combine the rules with the procedures. You'll walk away with an understanding of the regulations you need to know as an instrument pilot, as well as an operational understanding of how these rules affect your IFR operations and pilot decision-making. With us in the studio today is Roger Stenbach. Now, Roger will relay some information on regulations and procedures. Roger, welcome to the studio.
Great to be here.
A little on Roger's background. He is CEO of Stenbach Communications Incorporated and the executive producer of the Virtual Test Prep Ground School video courses produced for ASA. Now, one of these courses includes this instrument pilot course, which you're currently studying. Roger's aviation experience goes back more than 30 years. Now, in addition to his CFII rating, with more than 5,000 hours logged, he's also chief instructor for the Flight Instructor Refresher course for FERC for ASA. He's instructed thousands of students with his video ground school courses. And of course, these courses include the private pilot airplane, helicopter, instrument pilot, commercial pilot, and flight instructor ratings. He's also earned his Juris Doctor degree as a complement to his aviation avocation. Roger, again, welcome to the studio.
Glad to be here.
All right, let's get down to your experience with your first question. In your opinion, what are the greatest privileges that accompany an instrument rating?
Adding an instrument rating to a pilot certificate is one of the best things an aviator can do to broaden their flying opportunities. While the instrument rating allows for far greater flexibility than VFR flying, it's important to understand that both you and the aircraft need to be qualified to operate in IMC conditions. The FAA prescribes certain minimum conditions for IFR operations, but these are only minimums and apply equally to professional pilots and private pilots alike. They assume a high level of experience, skill, and knowledge. For this reason, I believe that establishing personal higher weather minimums is essential. While you're an IMC, as the sole pilot, it's not a good time to challenge your aviation capabilities.
The topics we'll cover are as follows: instrument rating requirements, currency requirements, equipment requirements, inspection requirements, oxygen requirements, logbook requirements, pre-flight requirements, airspace, cloud and visibility requirements, accident incident NOTAMs, spatial disorientation, optical illusions, lighting and scanning, altitude and course requirements, communication reports, and lost communications. Lots to cover in lesson number 5, so let's get right to it. Our first topic, instrument ratings. Join your instructor in the classroom for that discussion.
Hi, Rob Bremer again. By studying for the instrument rating, I assume you want to be able to fly in and through the clouds, or for that matter, in any weather less than VMC, as well as operate in airspace reserved for instrument-qualified pilots operating IFR-capable airplanes. You can't just walk into an FAA office and ask for IFR privileges. You must meet a number of qualifications first. Although FAR is used as the acronym for Federal Aviation Regulations and found throughout the regulations themselves and hundreds of other publications, the FAA is now actively discouraging its use. FAR also means Federal Acquisition Regulations. To eliminate any possible confusion, the FAA cites the Federal Aviation Regulations with reference to Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. For example, FAR Part 91.3 may be referenced as 14 CFR Part 91, Section 3.
What can you suggest to pilots about how they can be confident in interpreting the rules and regulations?
It's a good question, because if you don't understand the regulations, you can't follow them. But did you know that, as a matter of fact, Most regulations were written or reviewed by lawyers. While the language is generally not ambiguous, it's quite specific and detailed. It is written in such a way as to attempt to cover all possible circumstances encountered in the real world. But in most cases, it succeeds. However, in the real world of the aviation environment, events and circumstances are difficult to predict. As a result, the regulations do not necessarily suit all conditions. Thus, the FAA changes the regulations from time to time. So, here's my recommendation. I recommend that you should, in addition to clarifying and getting advice from a flight instructor, you must consult the FAQs that you can get online and read such magazines as AOPI Pilot, and also contact your local FSDO office.
Federal Aviation Regulation Part 61 stipulates that no person may act as PIC of a civil aircraft under IFR or in weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for VFR unless that pilot holds an instrument rating for the category of aircraft to be flown, as an example, airplane or rotorcraft. Commercial airplane pilots who carry passengers for hire at night or on cross-country flights of more than 50 nautical miles are also required to hold an instrument rating. In addition, any flight in Class A airspace from 18,000 feet MSL to and including flight level 600 requires an instrument rating. VFR flight is not allowed in Class A airspace.
Welcome back to the studio. Let's take a look at a couple of review questions. First one, when are you required to have an instrument rating for flight in VMC? When are you required? A, B, or C? The answer is C. Each person operating in an aircraft in Class A airspace must conduct that operation under Instrument Flight Rules, or IFR. All right, let's take a look at another one. A certificated commercial pilot who carries passengers for hire at night or in excess of 50 nautical miles is required to have at least which of these three? Your answer in this case is C again. A commercial pilot applicant must hold an instrument rating or the commercial pilot's certificate that is issued is endorsed with a limitation prohibiting the carriage of passengers for hire in aircraft on cross-country flights of more than 50 nautical miles or at night. There we have it. Let's move on to another topic. This one, on currency. Please join your instructor in the classroom for that topic.
This next section deals with IFR currency requirements. While we might all agree that being on top of your game is essential, the FAA provides us with useful guidance and actually spells out in detail the formal currency requirements.
Roger, we all know that being current and being proficient is a big difference between the two. What are your suggestions for maintaining currency and proficiency for IFR operations?
Well, the whole thing about currency is to get proficient. You can't be proficient without currency. So the FAA spells out minimum currency requirements, just like Rob has done in this lesson. Again, remember, these are minimum requirements. It's more important to be proficient. A proficient pilot not only meets the technical currency requirements, but also exceeds them. Generally, this occurs through further study, experience, and practice. Now, working with your flight instructor in the FAA Wings program is an effective method to accomplish this.
Unlike other privileges, such as riding a bicycle, the FAA has mandates that the pilot be competent. Much research has been done to evaluate competency of complex tasks. This research produced some interesting results. You've heard the expression, once you learn to ride a bike, you never forget it. That's mostly correct, since what's learned is primarily muscle memory. Muscle memory has a much longer half-life and stays with a person much longer. However, complex tasks like brain surgery and operating an aircraft solely by reference to instruments require more cognitive skills and less muscle memory. As a result, operating an aircraft by means of flight instruments in a complex airspace and communication environment and doing it safely, this requires much more recent experience. Now, one researcher concluded that in the performance of any given complex task, the last 60 days of recent experience is more valuable than the experience accumulated over the last 5 years. Therefore, the FAA has enacted these rules. No person may act as pilot in command under IFR or in weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for VFR unless, within the preceding 6 calendar months, that person has performed and logged under actual or simulated instrument conditions, meeting the following requirements: at least 6 instrument approaches, holding procedures, and intercepting and tracking through the use of navigation systems. Satisfactory accomplishment within the last 6 calendar months of an instrument proficiency check in the category of aircraft to be flown will also meet these recency requirements. If the recent instrument experience for 6 calendar months is not met, then you may not act as PIC under IFR until you pass an instrument proficiency check in the category of aircraft involved. This check must be given by an approved FAA examiner, instrument instructor, or FAA inspector.
All right, back for another review question. This one. An instrument-rated pilot who has not logged any instrument time in 1 year or more cannot serve as pilot in command under IFR unless the pilot, which one of these 3 completes that sentence? Your correct answer in this case is B. Unless the pilot passes an instrument proficiency check in the category of aircraft involved, given by an approved FAA examiner, instrument instructor, or FAA inspector. All right, next topic. Equipment. Back to your classroom and your instructor.
IFR flying is quite different than flying in VFR conditions. Not only must the pilot be proficient, but the aircraft must also be equipped to operate safely in instrument meteorological conditions.
Roger, what equipment do you consider mandatory for your IFR operations?
Well, it's certainly more than what the FAA prescribes. Now, the regulations are very specific of what equipment is required to operate an IFR. But again, these are minimum requirements. Our ground school and flight training normally covers the basic equipment like ADF, VOR, and so forth. Now, weather is generally presented as a pre-flight activity, so the pilot has the basic information to make a practical go, no-go weather decision, aviate, and navigate to the destination using paper charts, VOR, DME, and other systems. And that's the way most pilots operated until about 15 years ago, that's when GPS moving map systems and in-cockpit weather became available, although for a price, of course. Today, this equipment is relatively low cost in comparison to the overall cost of flying, at least. Now, with GPS and electronic flight bags devices, you can get a precise electronic chart with the aircraft position and the route and the weather overlaid on these charts. Now, one of the most challenging phases of flight is the instrument approach. Positional awareness, especially in IMC condition, requires constant cross-checking of the various navigation instruments to mentally place the aircraft on the paper approach place. Now, this has been done, of course, for more than 75 years, but it requires significant training, equipment, and sometimes even 2 pilots. Fortunately, however, in the last few years, several EFB manufacturers provide EFBs, remember, electronic flight bags, which display the approach procedure electronically with the little aircraft position clearly shown. Now, this really improves positional awareness, thus making the approach more enjoyable, increasing safety, and finally, a working autopilot is essential, especially when operating single-pilot IFR.
The FAA equipment requirements are quite specific. In many years past, not much was required to operate under IFR. Today, however, things have changed, and there are many cockpit configurations that can include GPS, DME, glass panels, and much more. As you may well imagine, In today's complex airspace, it's unlikely that all general aviation aircraft are equipped for flight under IFR. 14 CFR 91.205 details the instruments and equipment required for IFR operations. For IFR flight, the following instruments and equipment are required: a gyroscopic rate of turn indicator and skid slip indicator, a gyroscopic attitude indicator, and a gyroscopic heading indicator, and a sensitive altimeter. In addition to gyroscopic instruments, you need the following: all VFR day and night equipment, two-way radio and navigational equipment appropriate to the ground facilities to be used. You also need a clock with a sweep second hand or a digital display clock. You need a generator of adequate capacity, and you need a Mode C transponder with encoding altimeter for flight above 10,000 feet MSL in controlled airspace. Distance measuring equipment, or DME, is required when you are at or above flight level 240 using VORs for navigation. Now, should the DME fail at or above 24,000 feet MSL, you should report the failure to ATC immediately, and then you may continue at and above 24,000 feet MSL to the next airport of intended landing. Fortunately, most general aviation aircraft have this equipment installed. For practical application, however, most pilots have at least one or more GPS receivers, some sort of weather avoidance such as a strike finder or a live satellite weather receiver. Much of the additional capability is now also available in electronic flight bags. These are called EFBs. EFBs even include complete electronic charts, including instrument procedures shown right on their display.
Back again for a review question. This one: what minimum navigation equipment is required for IFR flight? The minimum navigation equipment, A, B, or C? Your answer? C. Two-way radio communication system and navigational equipment appropriate to the ground facilities to be used is required for IFR flight. All right, let's tackle yet another topic here. This time out, inspections. Join your instructor in the classroom to cover that topic.
Now that the aircraft is equipped for flight in IMC, or instrument meteorological conditions, the pilot must ensure that the equipment is working properly. Again, the FAA provides specific guidance.
Now, IFR operations require a lot more inspections than VFR. Where do you log the required aircraft inspections?
Well, you got to have a log of them, that's for sure. But, some information such as VOR checks need to be done more frequently, for example, every 30 days. Now, what's worked for me over the years for both VFR and IFR flight is a paper logbook in which I record this information. However, the pitot-static system, transponder, ELT, and GPS equipment is checked during the annual inspection and is recorded in the aircraft logbook. Now, I don't keep my aircraft maintenance records in the airplane, but I leave them with my mechanic. Remember, without those logs, an aircraft is not nearly as inviting to would-be thieves.
You may have heard of Murphy's Law. One of these laws states that any man-made contraption, no matter how simple, eventually fails. The second law states that the longer such a contraption has been faithfully providing its worth, the more likely it is that it will betray you and fail. The third law states that any failure will occur at the worst possible time and place. However, a positive corollary of these laws is that no matter the failure, when it occurs, or who may have been responsible, and accounting for any and all evidence, all mishaps and failures can be blamed on Murphy's Law. In other words, stuff happens. Now, some mechanics believe that for each and every inspection of any system, a little bit of Murphy sneaks back into the equation. While no one's ever been able to repeal Murphy's Law, much can be done to mitigate its adverse consequences. That's where the FAA comes in. Fortunately, the inspection list is very short. The pilot operator is ultimately responsible for meeting all required inspection requirements. The aircraft must have an annual inspection, or if it's operated for commercial purposes, it must have a 100-hour inspection. The FAA mandates that the altimeter be checked every 24 calendar months. The VOR receivers must be checked within 30 days and found to be within limits. The emergency locator transmitter, or ELT batteries, must be replaced when 50% of their shelf life has expired or after 1 hour of cumulative use. Check the date on the outside of the transmitter case, and the transponder static system and encoder must be checked every 24 calendar months. These inspections must be documented. They're often kept in the aircraft logbook, found either in the glove box or at the maintenance shop. As a PIC, you are responsible for confirming these tests and inspections are current before departing on your IFR flight. Here are the specifics. 14 CFR 91.3 lists the responsibility and authority of the pilot in command. It states, the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. In an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, as PIC, you may deviate from any regulation to the extent required to meet that emergency. Now, 14 CFR 91.409 covers inspections and states, no person may operate an aircraft unless within the preceding 12 calendar months it has had an annual inspection and has been approved for return to service by an authorized mechanic. This annual inspection must be performed by a person authorized for this task and entered as an annual inspection in the required maintenance records. 91.409 also states that no person may operate an aircraft carrying any person other than a crew member for hire, and no person may give flight instruction for hire in an aircraft which that person provides, unless within the preceding 100 hours of time in service the aircraft has received an annual or 100-hour inspection. 91.411 details the altimeter system and altitude reporting equipment tests and inspections. It states no person may operate an airplane or helicopter in controlled airspace under IFR unless within the preceding 24 calendar months each static pressure system, each altimeter instrument, and each automatic pressure altitude reporting system has been tested. Now, 91.171 covers the required VOR and equipment check for IFR operations. The VOR equipment must be maintained, checked, and inspected under an approved procedure or been operationally checked within the preceding 30 days and found to be within the limits of the permissible indicated bearing error. The ELT must be checked every 12 calendar months. The batteries must be replaced if the ELT has been operated for more than 1 cumulative hour or if 50% of their useful life has expired. No persons may use an ATC transponder unless within the preceding 24 calendar months the ATC transponder has been tested and inspected.
Welcome back to the studio. Let's take a look at a couple of review questions. An aircraft altimeter system test and inspection must be accomplished within which of these, A, B, or C? Test and inspection must be accomplished, C, within 24 calendar months. Altimeter system and altitude reporting equipment tests and inspections. A, no person may operate an airplane or helicopter in controlled airspace under IFR unless 1, within the preceding 24 calendar months, each static pressure system, each altimeter instrument, and each automatic pressure altitude reporting system has been tested. Answer there, C. Okay, next question. Who is responsible for determining that the altimeter system has been checked and found to meet 14 CFR Part 91 requirements for a particular instrument flight? Who is responsible for determining that? Your answer? C again. Paragraph 91.3, responsibility and authority of the pilot in command. A, the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. All right, tackling another topic. This one on oxygen. Take it back to your classroom and your instructor.
Although there are oxygen requirements for VFR operation, IFR operations can routinely be flown at higher altitudes than VFR flight. For this reason, oxygen requirements are even more important. Pilots are encouraged to use supplemental oxygen above 5,000 feet MSL during night operations.
Roger, do you carry supplemental oxygen on all your IFR flights?
I do. And remember, flying IFR can often mean operating at higher altitudes than a comparable VFR flight. For me and my passengers, supplemental oxygen is not an option, but a requirement for all but the briefest lower altitude flights. Many airplanes regularly fly up to 18,000 feet MSL, VFR or IFR. You know, that's several thousand feet higher than the legal requirements for oxygen. So oxygen is really necessary for most cross-country flights. I use one of those inexpensive oxygen saturation meters that you attach to your finger. And I've discovered that the oxygen level begins to drop for most people above 8,000 feet. For this reason, I provide and use oxygen above that level. It makes me feel better and much more alert. And this is a cannula. It provides oxygen for high altitude flying, and you can use these cannulas up to about 18,000 feet. Above 18,000 feet, the FAA wants you to use a full face mask that covers both your mouth and your nose as well. But these are pretty handy. I always encourage my pilot friends to put on oxygen maybe when they get up to about 8,000 feet or higher, especially at night. It'll make you feel better. And these are very convenient. Just put them on like this and snug them up here like this. Notice I can talk. I can use my headset and also easily put my sunglasses on. So there you go, oxygen for high altitude flying.
Now, 14 CFR 91.211 stipulates that the required flight crew must use oxygen after 30 minutes at cabin pressure altitudes above 12,500 feet MSL and at all times at cabin pressure altitudes above 14,000 feet MSL. Every occupant of the aircraft must be provided with supplemental oxygen at cabin pressure altitudes above 15,000 feet MSL. Hypoxia is a state of oxygen deficiency, and it impairs functions of the brain and other organs. Headaches, dizziness, drowsiness, and euphoria are all symptoms of hypoxia. Hyperventilation, a deficiency of carbon dioxide, can be the result of rapid or extra deep breathing due to emotional tension, anxiety, or fear. This animation summarizes the oxygen as a function of altitude. Note that for flight of more than 30 minutes above 12,500 to 14,000 feet, pilots must use oxygen. As the aircraft climbs above 14,000 feet, the pilot must use oxygen at all times. And above 15,000 feet, passengers must be provided with oxygen.
Very good, Roger. Now, how do you go about selecting the altitude for the en route phase of flight?
Well, the answer to this question depends a lot on the aircraft's altitude capability. Observing the east-west rule is one of the factors, however. So is terrain, the MEA, MRA, distance, and fuel on board. What's worked for me is high is usually better, except for very short flights. No, I'm talking about 12,000 to 18,000 feet when VFR or IFR, and when IFR from 18 to 25,000 feet. There's usually far less traffic up there. Fuel efficiency is much improved, navigation reception is better, and the weather conditions are usually on top VFR and certainly better than down below. However, all this can change with winds, cloud tops, and or cloud bases. So weather conditions are the primary factor in selecting the en route altitude.
Okay, we have one review question for you on oxygen requirements. What is the oxygen requirement for unpressurized aircraft at 15,000 feet? Which of these is correct? Your correct answer is C. Paragraph 91.211, supplemental oxygen. No person may operate a civil aircraft at cabin pressure altitudes above 15,000 feet MSL unless each occupant of the aircraft is provided with supplemental oxygen. All right, moving right along. Our next topic, logbook. We ask you to join your instructor in the classroom for that discussion.
Unlike other vehicles, such as your car or motorcycle, pilots must log certain flight and instructional times to ensure safety of flight. Let's cover these now. Here is a logbook checklist. While not required by the regulations, non-currency logbook entries are encouraged. However, to ensure currency requirements are met, pilots must log all actual and simulated instrument flight. Pilots are authorized to log both simulated and actual instrument time during which the pilot operates the aircraft solely by reference to instruments. In 61.51, pilot logbooks, each person must document and record the 1. Training and aeronautical experience used to meet the requirements for certificate, rating, or flight review, and 2. The aeronautical experience required for meeting the recent flight experience. Now there's a subparagraph B, logbook entries. For the purpose of meeting the requirements of paragraph A of this section, each person must enter the following information for each flight or lesson logged. First, we have general information and date and total flight time or lesson time. We have location, where the aircraft departed and arrived, or for lessons in a flight simulator or flight training device, the location where the lesson occurred. We have the type and identification of aircraft, flight simulator, or flight training device as appropriate. The name of a safety pilot, if required by 91.109B of this chapter. Now, in experience and training, we have solo flight, second in command, flight and ground training received from an authorized instructor, training received in a flight simulator or a flight training device from an authorized instructor. We also have flight conditions, day or night, actual instruments, simulated instrument conditions in flight, a flight simulator, or a flight training device. A safety pilot must occupy the other control seats when the PIC is operating the aircraft solely by reference to instruments. The safety pilot is required to be an appropriately rated pilot, but there's no requirement to have an instrument rating. For example, a Cessna 172 fixed gear simpler airplane or a turbocharged Bonanza complex and high performance airplane either is approved for safety pilot purposes, even if they are required for your flight review. In 61.51, pilot logbooks further requires that for the purpose of obtaining instrument experience in an aircraft other than a glider, performed and logged under actual or simulated instrument conditions, training must be accomplished either in flight in the appropriate category of aircraft for the instrument privileges sought, or in a flight simulator or flight training device that is representative of the aircraft category for the instrument privileges sought.
Time for another review question, this one on logbooks. Which flight time may be logged as instrument time when on an instrument flight plan? A, B, or C, which is correct? Your correct answer is B. Paragraph 61.51, pilot logbooks 1. For the purpose of obtaining instrument experience in an aircraft other than a glider, performed and logged under actual or simulated instrument conditions, either in flight in the appropriate category of aircraft for the instrument privileges sought. Your answer B in this case. Okay, that one question, we move along to our pre-flight requirements. Back to your classroom and your instructor.
I love this regulation. It's really a catch-all for any mistake a pilot may perpetrate during the pre-flight. Specifically, it mandates before beginning a flight, the PIC is required to become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. In other words, 9 times out of 10, if you break it, it's your fault. Let's check out the pre-flight requirements for a minute. what does available mean? What does information mean? You get my drift. And if it's not available, does it matter? For example, let's say there are 10 weather service providers available, each providing flight planning capability. Does that mean the pilot must check each provider? Or let's say the pilot is in the backcountry without phone, radio, or internet service. Does that mean the weather at the departure, en route, and the destination is not important? Some regulations require a large dose of common sense, and this is one of them. Anyway, here is the official FAA language. In 91.103, pre-flight action states the information for an IFR flight must include weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, alternatives available if the planned flight cannot be completed, and any known traffic delays of which the pilot in command has been advised by ATC. Now, it continues. For any flight, runway lengths at airports of intended use, takeoff and landing distance data, and other reliable information appropriate to the aircraft relating to aircraft performance under expected values of airport elevation, runway slope, aircraft gross weight, and wind and temperature. So, in short, the PIC is required to become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. This must include weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, alternatives available if the flight cannot be completed as planned, any known traffic delays, runway lengths, and expected takeoff and landing distances.
Okay, now let's take a review question on pre-flight requirements. Before beginning any flight under IFR, the pilot in command must become familiar with all available information concerning that flight, including A, B, or C. Your correct answer is C. Paragraph 91.103, pre-flight action. 2. For civil aircraft other than those specified in paragraph B1 of this section, other reliable information appropriate to the aircraft relating to aircraft performance under expected values of airport elevation and runway slope, aircraft gross weight, and wind and temperature. The answer is C there. Okay. Now let's move along to our topic list. Down to airspace and back to the classroom.
Now I promise you that I'll spice up this lesson a bit. So next up is airspace. I've always loved this expression. It's not space or navigational space or flying space or outer space, it's airspace. The best way to learn airspace classification is pictorially, as shown in these illustrations. This graphic illustrates the airspace classification ranging from the base of the pyramid, Class G, being least restrictive, to Class A, which is most restrictive.
Roger, why is it so important for you to know, for a pilot to know what airspace, what class of airspace they're in?
Well, one obvious example is that entering Class B airspace without the proper clearance can result in a nasty letter from the FAA or create serious and dangerous conditions for everyone. Now, as you learned, operating IFR places more of the communication burden back on the shoulders of ATC. They essentially guide you through the various airspace classes, providing the communications and clearances as you go. Now, you'll usually be operating in either Class E, D, C, or Class B airspace. Under these conditions, and on an IFR flight, you'll be in ATC contact anyway, and clearances will be given to you as needed. However, when operating VFR flight, you must consult your sectional charts and communicate with ATC to ensure that proper clearance requirements are met.
Good enough. What advice would you offer a pilot conducting single pilot IFR operations?
Well, first let me emphasize that single pilot IFR can be and is conducted safely every day, so long as the pilot is really current and competent. Now, having said that, remember that as single pilot, you're the aviator, navigator, and communicator. That's a fairly high workload. Now you add some IMC conditions, a complex aircraft, some ATC chatter, unwieldy paper charts, and perhaps a tired pilot, and you have a recipe for trouble. It really makes things a lot easier when you have a co-pilot who can help with these tasks. The co-pilot can cross-check your communications and navigation frequencies, fly the aircraft as you study the charts, or communicate with ATC. Now, why do you think the airlines and most Part 91 operators fly as a crew of a pilot and a co-pilot? So, unless you're well rested, current and competent, operating single pilot IFR should be avoided. I certainly don't recommend it. However, another pilot rated for VFR or better can still be very helpful with navigation and communication tasks.
Now, Class G airspace is the portion of airspace that's not been designated Class A, B, C, D, or E airspace. It's uncontrolled. ATC has neither the authority nor the responsibility for exercising control over air traffic in these areas. It is uncontrolled airspace. Think G for government free. Except when in clouds, the PIC is responsible for separation. IFR is allowed so long as the pilot is rated and the aircraft is equipped accordingly. Operating in Class G airspace requires at least a student pilot certificate, and ATC will provide VFR advisories, workload permitting. Equipment and clearance requirements are: for VFR flight, no special equipment is needed, and for IFR flight, nothing beyond the equipment required to operate IFR. And there is no ATC clearance required. Now for Class E airspace. Class E is controlled airspace that's not been designated Class A, B, C, or D. Think of E for everywhere else. There are more stringent weather minimums that are applicable to VFR operations. And it separates aircraft on Victor Airways during instrument approaches. So here are Class E characteristics. Airway is 8 nautical miles wide, and it ranges from 1,200 feet AGL up to, but not including, 18,000 feet MSL. It's designated controlled airspace. So let's take a look at a 3D Class E Victor Airway. Again, it's 8 nautical miles wide and ranges from 1,200 feet AGL up to, but not including, 18,000 feet MSL. Here is a Class E transition area. VFR pilots must have VFR minimums. It contains airports with instrument approaches, and it protects approaching IFR aircraft. It ranges from 700 AGL to 1,200 AGL. So here is surface-based Class E airspace. It's designated by this dotted magenta line. It surrounds airports with precision approaches. It protects IFR traffic during instrument conditions. VFR pilots must have VFR weather minimums. The airspace ranges from the surface to 700 AGL and up to 1,200 AGL. Pilot classifications and services are: requires at least a student pilot certificate, and ATC will provide VFR advisories, workload permitting. Equipment and clearance requirements are: for VFR flight, no special equipment is needed. No ATC is required for VFR traffic. But for IFR traffic, you must have an ATC clearance. Class D airspace is identified by a segmented blue line, as indicated here. It is controlled airspace. So you want to think D for dialogue with the tower. It's established around tower-controlled airports, and all pilots must communicate with the tower regardless of weather. Here are the Class D dimensions. Now, note that this area, it indicates a top of 2,700 foot MSL. Here the surface is 200 foot AGL, so the top of the airspace limit is 2,500 feet AGL. It generally has a radius of 4 nautical miles. Now let's take a look at Class D airspace. Class D airspace is surrounded by Class E airspace. When the tower is not operating and weather information is not available, it refers to Class E airspace. There's a 200-knot speed limit when operating below 2,500 feet and within 4 nautical miles of a primary Class D airport. Aerobatics, unmanned balloons, and ultralight vehicles are prohibited without ATC approval. Here's a terminal radar service area. A terminal radar service area, or TRSA, is Class D airspace surrounded by airspace with radar coverage. It requires only voluntary participation. Traffic is handled by radar approach together with tower, and radar services outside Class D. Pilot classifications and services are: requires at least a student pilot certificate, and ATC will provide VFR advisories, workload permitting. Equipment and clearance requirements are: for VFR flight, two-way radio is required to establish radio communications. No ATC clearance is required for VFR traffic. But for IFR traffic, you must have an ATC clearance. Class C airspace is controlled airspace surrounding larger metropolitan areas in designated airports within which ATC provides radar and vectoring and sequencing for all IFR and VFR aircraft. There are a large number of aircraft. Two-way radio is required, and communication with ATC must be maintained while flying within Class C airspace. A Mode C transponder is required within and up to 10,000 feet MSL over Class C airspace. Class C airports are identified on charts by a solid magenta line. Here are the Class C characteristics. Think C for communications within 20 miles. All aircraft must have a Mode C transponder. You must establish radio contact before entry. These are the Class C airspace dimensions. Beginning at the surface, the core has a 5 nautical mile radius. The top of the airspace has a 10 nautical mile radius. The outer area has a 20 nautical mile radius. Note that radio contact is not mandatory up in this area. The upper airspace begins at 1,200 foot AGL and extends up to 4,000 foot AGL. Here are the Class C communication and speed requirements. In addition to the Mode C transponder requirements, all aircraft entering Class C airspace must establish two-way radio communications with ATC. ATC communications are established as soon as ATC repeats the call sign. However, once established, pilots must comply with all ATC instructions. Speed is restricted to 200 knots below 2,500 feet and within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport. Aerobatics and ultralight vehicles and unmanned free balloons are also prohibited. Pilot classifications and services are: requires at least a student pilot certificate, and there is IFR-VFR separation service for IFR traffic. ATC will provide VFR advisories, workload permitting. Equipment and clearance requirements are: for VFR flight, two-way radio is required to establish radio communications. ATC must identify you by radio contact containing at least your N number. Next up is Class B airspace. It's identified on charts by a solid blue line that's shown right here. It also includes a 30 nautical mile Mode C veil. Class B airspace is generally established around major airports. Characteristics consist of controlled airspace within which all aircraft are subject to certain operating rules as well as pilot and equipment requirements. There are a very large number of aircraft. Each location will contain at least one primary airport. ATC clearance is required prior to operating within Class B airspace. You should expect to find air carrier operations. In addition, each aircraft must be equipped with two-way radio with appropriate ATC frequencies. a VOR or TACAN receiver unless flying VFR. There is a mandatory Mode C transponder requirement. ATC may authorize deviations from the transponder requirements, and there are some local exceptions when operating to non-primary airports. Requests for deviation must be submitted to the controlling ATC facility at least 1 hour prior to the proposed operation. Now, it generally services more than one airport. A pilot landing or taking off from an airport within Class B airspace must hold at least a private pilot certificate or meet stringent student pilot requirements. When operating to or from the primary airport, large turbine-powered airplanes must remain at or above the floor of Class B airspace. So here are the Class B dimensions. From the surface, the airspace ceiling is 10,000-foot MSL. The radius is 20 nautical miles with mandatory ATC clearance requirements. In addition, there's a 30 nautical mile radius veil in which a Mode C transponder is mandatory. Here are chart identification characteristics. Note the ceiling and floor indication right on the chart. The indications are in hundreds of feet. In this example, it indicates a floor of 3,000 feet and a ceiling of 10,000 feet. Here are the Class B clearance requirements. You must receive a clearance to enter Class B airspace. You must advise ATC of your intended altitude and route of flight before departing an airport in Class B airspace. A clearance into Class B airspace must be positive. Mere radio contact is not enough, but Piper 1234 Foxtrot Papa is cleared into the Seattle Class B airspace. Well, that's okay. Many types of published VFR routes permit pilots to transition around, under, and through Class B airspace. These are usually only permissible in VFR conditions. VFR flyways provide the pilot a route in which to transition in an organized manner. While no clearance is required, radio contact must be made with ATC. VFR corridors are holes in Class B airspace through which pilots can transition without radio contact or an ATC clearance. Now, pilot classifications and services requires at least a private pilot certificate or a student pilot with a flight instructor endorsement. ATC provides separation for all aircraft. Equipment and clearance requirements are: for VFR flight, two-way radio is required to establish radio communications, and a Mode C transponder is mandatory. You must have an ATC clearance to enter this airspace. Okay, Class A airspace extends from 18,000 feet MSL to and including flight level 600. No VFR flight, including VFR on top, is authorized in Class A airspace. Class A airspace begins at 18,000 feet MSL up to 60,000 feet. Above that altitude, the airspace reverts back to Class E airspace. By the way, did you notice that above flight level 600 or 60,000 feet, there's no more airspace so far as the FAA is concerned? You could actually fly VFR up there. It might take a different kind of airplane, something like the Rutan boys built, but theoretically, it might be possible. Now, pilot classifications and services requires at least a private pilot certificate with an instrument rating. ATC provides separation for all aircraft. Equipment and clearance requirements are: two-way radio is required to establish radio communications, and a Mode C transponder is mandatory. This table summarizes the airspace classifications that we just covered. There are two components to the table. The first here covers permitted operations, entry requirements, minimum pilot qualifications, and two-way radio communications. The second component here covers aircraft separation, traffic advisories, and chart depictions. I recommend you pause this video should you need further clarification. Next up is special use airspace. It's categorized as follows: prohibited, then restricted, followed by warning areas, then military operation areas, then military training routes, and parachute jump areas. Now here's one I like. It's an alert area. Does this mean except when you're in an alert area we can be nodding at the switch? I hope not. Here is a prohibited area. It generally is created for security reasons. It may only be penetrated with special permission. An example is prohibited area P56, covering the White House. It may denote the presence of unusual, often invisible hazards to flight. Here is a restricted area. It's not entirely prohibited to flight activities. It includes areas in which unauthorized penetration is illegal and extremely dangerous. It's identified by a defined area that's marked with this letter R. Altitude and times are shown on the chart legend. Next are warning areas. Warning areas cover airspace over international waters. They contain the same sort of hazardous activities as those in restricted areas, but they're located in international airspace, so the FAA has no jurisdiction over this area. So you should exercise extreme caution. Next up is an MOA, or Military Operation Area. MOA separate high-speed military aircraft from non-military. They're identified on charts by a defined area that looks like this. You should contact a flight service station or ATC center when you're within 100 miles of the MOA to determine if it's active. If it is active, pilots may request traffic advisories. ATC separates certain military activities from IFR traffic and informs VFR traffic when the MOAs are active. Here are military training routes. They are one-way, high-speed routes for military traffic below 10,000 feet, and they're shown on sectional charts. Pilots should contact ATC within 100 miles to determine if they're active. Not all MTRs are published. Now, here is a parachute jump area. You should monitor the jump frequency. Many jump operations broadcast on the Common Traffic Airport Frequency. They're found in the Airport Facility Directory and sectional charts. Pilots should remain clear of these areas. Next up is a Temporary Flight Restriction, or TFR. 14 CFR Part 91.145, or Temporary Flight Restriction, defines TFR as a geographically limited, short-term airspace restriction. TFRs often include major sporting events, natural disaster areas, air shows, space launches, and presidential movements. Large presidential TFRs may close off not only the airport Air Force One is using, but nearby airports as well. They contain the same sort of hazardous activities as those in restricted areas, but are located in international airspace.
All right, let's take a look at some review questions on airspace. First, we're going to ask you to refer to a figure in a moment. What is the floor of Class E airspace when designated in conjunction with an airport which has an approved IAP? Which of these three answers is correct for the floor of Class E? Let's look at our figure. We see Class E airspace. We see that the floor is 700 AGL. We go back to our question and the answer is B. Assuming Class E airspace has not been designated to the surface, the floor of Class E airspace is 700 feet AGL when designated in conjunction with an airport which has an approved instrument approach procedure. Your answer there, B. Next question. Again, we'll take a look at that figure. What is the normal lateral limits for Class D airspace? Normal lateral, A, B, or C. We look at our figure. We find Class D airspace, again, relative to the other classifications. We go back to our question. The answer is C. 4 nautical miles for the normal lateral in Class D. Next question. Again, referring to our figure, which altitude is the upper limit for Class A airspace? Which altitude is the upper limit for Class A? Our figure, we see Class A from 18,000 feet to 60,000 feet. Back to our question, the upper limit, C. Class A airspace is that airspace from 18,000 feet MSL up to and including 60,000 feet, including that airspace overlying the waters within 12 nautical miles of the coast of the 48 contiguous states and Alaska. Answer there, C. Okay, next question. MOAs are established to, which of these is correct? Your correct answer is B. Military operations areas, or MOAs, consist of airspace of defined vertical and lateral limits established for the purpose of separating certain military training activities from IFR traffic. 4 questions, 4 good answers there. Moving to a new topic. This time out, clouds and visibility. Back to your instructor in the classroom to discuss that.
While some IFR pilots might assume that since they can now fly in clouds, cloud clearance and visibility requirements don't apply to them. And that's far from reality, since rarely is any IFR flight flown 100% of the time in instrument meteorological conditions. It's been my personal experience that IMC exists for just a few minutes of any given flight. That's usually during the departure and the approach phase, and occasionally while en route. During the rest of the time, it's quite possible for you to be operating on a VFR flight plan or VFR on top. When operating under VFR or when operating with a VFR on top clearance, the pilot must maintain the required visibility and cloud clearance appropriate to the altitude flown. So here we go. Here are Class G VFR limits. Below 1,200 feet AGL, you must have 1 statute mile visibility and be clear of clouds. Here are Class G night VFR requirements. You must have 3 statute mile visibility and be clear of clouds by 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. Here are the Class G airspace requirements between 1,200 feet AGL and 10,000 feet MSL. You must have 1 statute mile visibility and be clear of clouds by 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. Here are the Class G airspace night requirements between 1,200 feet AGL and 10,000 feet MSL. You must have 3 statute miles visibility and be clear of clouds, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. Here are the Class G airspace mountainous area requirements. Between 1,200 feet AGL and 10,000 foot MSL, you must have 5 statute miles visibility, and when above 10,000 feet, be clear of clouds by 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. Here are the Class E airspace day and night requirements up to 10,000 feet MSL. You must have 3 statute miles visibility and be clear of clouds by 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. Here are the Class E airspace mountainous area requirements above 10,000 feet MSL. You must have 5 statute mile visibility and be clear of clouds by 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 mile horizontally. Here are the Class C and D airspace day and night VFR requirements up to 10,000 feet MSL. You must have 3 statute miles visibility and be clear of clouds by 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. Here are the Class B airspace day and night VFR requirements. 3 statute mile visibility and be clear of clouds. Here are the Class A airspace day and night VFR requirements above 18,000 feet MSL IFR only. Special VFR conditions are as follows. It's designated for operations in controlled airspace with weather below VFR minimums. All pilots must have a clearance from the control tower. An instrument rating is required, and you must request a special VFR clearance from the airport control tower. Special VFR weather minimums are 1 statute mile visibility, and you must be clear of clouds.
Welcome back. We have one review question for you. What is the minimum in-flight visibility and distance from clouds required for an airplane operating less than 1,200 feet AGL under special VFR during daylight hours in Class E airspace? A, B, or C? The correct answer is C. Special VFR operations require the pilot to remain clear of clouds, and ground visibility must be at least 1 statute mile, or if ground visibility is not reported, flight visibility must be at least 1 statute mile. Correct answer there, again, C. All right, our next topic. Accidents and incidents. Back to the classroom for that topic.
Next up is aircraft accident and incident reporting and NOTAMs. Now, as I said earlier, Murphy is constantly looking for a chance to trip us up, and this can happen to even the best of pilots. Should such an event occur, the FAA and the NTSB want to know about it. They use this information to enhance flight safety, either through regulatory or training requirements. Therefore, certain reports are required following an aircraft accident if an aircraft is overdue and is believed to have been involved in an accident or after any of a number of listed incidents. The National Transportation Safety Board deals with and is governed by NTSB Part 830, Aviation Incidents and Accident Investigations. So an accident is defined as an occurrence in which any person suffers death or serious injury, or in which the aircraft receives substantial damage. Substantial damage is anything that affects the structural integrity of the performance, like this wing here, or flight characteristics of the aircraft. Accidents are not things like an engine failure on a reciprocating engine, dented skin, punctured fabric, damage to the landing gear, or damage to a propeller. You must notify the NTSB immediately, even if there are no injuries. A written report is required within 10 days of the accident. The reporting procedures are set forth in NTSB Part 830. An incident is an occurrence other than an accident which affects or could affect the safety of the aircraft operation. A written report must be submitted only if the NTSB requests one. Serious incidents that require immediate NTSB notification are the inability of any required crew member to perform normal flight duties because of an in-flight injury or illness, or an in-flight fire, or a flight system malfunction or failure. Notification is also required for an overdue airplane that's believed to be involved in an accident. In the event of an accident, do not disturb the accident site before the NTSB takes custody unless you're assisting injured people or you're protecting wreckage or cargo. Next up are NOTAMs, or notifications to airmen. These are notifications from the FAA that are disseminated to pilots. This includes important information of which you must be aware before conducting any flight operation, but is not likely to be published or disseminated through other channels. Do you remember the pre-flight rule I talked about earlier? Before beginning a flight, the PIC is required to become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. Well, this is one of them. I distinctly remember one time I was an owner of a pristine Piper Arrow. I sold it just a month earlier, and it landed at an airport on which a ditch was cut across the landing runway. And this was covered by a NOTAM, but unfortunately not checked by the pilot. You can guess the results. Notices to airmen include time-critical information that could affect a pilot's decision to make a flight. It's either temporary in nature or not known far enough in advance to be included in publications. There are two NOTAM categories. NOTAM D data receives wide dissemination and is appended to hourly weather reports. It includes information pertaining to all airports with approved instrument approach procedures, NAVAIDs, that are part of the National Airspace System, and certain VFR airports. NOTAMs L NOTAM L information is distributed locally. It advises of taxiway closures, airport beacon outage, equipment near runways, and NOTAM information concerning airports. FDC Flight Data Center NOTAMs are regulatory in nature, and they primarily advise of safety of flight items such as changes to aeronautical charts and instrument approach procedures. FDC NOTAMs are kept on file at flight service stations until published or canceled.
Okay, related to the information you just covered on accidents and incidents. Question: which publication covers the procedure required for aircraft accident and incident reporting? Which of these three publications? Your correct answer is C. A written report is to be required within 10 days of the accident. The reporting procedures are set forth in NTSB Part 830. One more question. What is the purpose of FDC NOTAMs? Which of these three, A, B, or C, is correct? Your correct answer is C. FDC, Flight Data Center, NOTAMs, are regulatory in nature and primarily advise of safety of flight items, such as changes to aeronautical charts and instrument approach procedures. Correct answer, C. Next topic. Spatial disorientation. Great topic. Back to the classroom and your instructor.
Let's now cover spatial disorientation, which is sometimes called vertigo. If you fly long enough, you'll experience it. So, knowing that can happen, here's some guidance on how to cope with this uncomfortable condition. There's not a person alive that's immune to spatial disorientation. It can cause seasickness, car sickness, and in airplanes, it results in vertigo. In extreme cases, the pilot can be so impaired that he'll literally not know up from down or left from right. Some people are more susceptible to this malady than others, but we can all be afflicted by it. It's usually brought on when the flight is in instrument meteorological conditions and the pilot fails to scan and trust his flight instruments. Under rare occasions, some pilots have experienced spatial disorientation in VFR conditions. Illusions caused by the body's motion sensing system are most commonly encountered during instrument flight. The system may be stimulated by motion of the aircraft or by head or body movement. Your body is not capable of distinguishing between centrifugal force and gravity, nor can it detect small changes in velocity. So, this system of your ears may also produce false sensations, such as interpreting deceleration as a turn in the opposite direction. These illusions and false sensations may lead to spatial disorientation. The most common form of spatial disorientation is the leans, and this is resulting from a banked attitude that's not being perceived by the pilot. Abrupt correction of a banked attitude may stimulate the motion sensing fluid of the inner ear, creating the sensation of banking in the opposite direction. The pilot may roll the aircraft back to its original attitude until he or she thinks the aircraft is straight and level. Or if level flight is maintained, the pilot may still feel compelled to align his or her body with the perceived vertical. The motion sensing system in the inner ear may lead to a false perception of the true vertical. For example, in a well-coordinated turn without visual reference, the only sensation is that of the body being pressed into the seat, a sensation normally associated with a climb, and the pilot may falsely interpret it as a climb. On the other hand, recovering from turns reduces pressure on the seat and may lead the pilot to believe the aircraft is descending. Spatial disorientation can happen to anyone since it's due to the normal function and limitations of the senses of balance. It only becomes dangerous when the pilot fails to suppress the false sensations and places complete reliance on the indication of the flight instruments. Eventually, as pilots acquire instrument flight experience, the onset of spatial disorientation lessens as trust in the flight instruments is built up. An abrupt change from climb to straight and level flight can create the illusion of tumbling backwards. The disoriented pilot will push the aircraft into a nose-low attitude, possibly intensifying the illusion. This is called inversion illusion. Now, a rapid acceleration during takeoff can create the illusion of being in a nose-up attitude. The disoriented pilot will push the aircraft into a nose-low or dive attitude. This is called somatographic illusion.
Okay, let's tackle another review question. Which procedure is recommended to prevent or overcome spatial disorientation? Which procedure of these is correct? Your correct answer is C. To overcome spatial disorientation, you must rely on the indications of the flight instruments. That's your answer, C. Okay, next topic. And it's optical illusions. Join your instructor in the classroom to discuss optical illusions.
Without optical illusions, most magic would not be possible. What that means is what you see may not actually be what you think it is. Our optical system is based on environmental norms. So long as the environment is normal, what you see is what you get. When things change from normal, pilots are most susceptible to these illusions. Various atmospheric and surface features encountered while landing may create the illusion of incorrect distance from or height above the landing runway. Some of the more common illusions are atmospheric illusion. Atmospheric haze can create the illusion of being at a greater distance from the runway. Rain on the windshield can create an illusion of greater height. The pilot who does not recognize these illusions will fly a lower approach. Additional illusions include runway width illusion, runway and terrain slope illusion, sloping cloud formations. Now, here's an example of runway slope optical illusion. An upsloping runway or terrain can create the illusion that the aircraft is at a higher altitude than it actually is, while a downsloping runway has the opposite effect. So here's a runway width illusion. A runway that's narrower than usual, like the one you see here, can create the illusion that the aircraft is at a higher altitude than it actually is, causing the pilot to fly a lower than normal approach. A wider than usual runway can have the opposite effect. Sloping cloud formations and an obscured horizon, a dark scene spread with ground lights and stars, or certain geometric patterns of ground light can create the illusion of not being aligned correctly with the actual horizon. The disoriented pilot will place the aircraft in a dangerous position. This illusion is called false horizons.
All right, we have one review question for you on optical illusions. What effect does haze have on the ability to see traffic or terrain features during flight? A, B, or C? Your correct answer is C. Atmospheric haze causes the illusion of being a greater distance from the runway. The pilot who does not recognize this illusion will fly a lower approach. Okay, tackling yet another topic. We move along to lighting and scanning. Back in the classroom for lighting and scanning.
Next up is cockpit lighting and scanning. While the VFR pilot may operate at night, night flying, even in VFR conditions, can present challenges similar to instrument flying. For this reason, the FAA places special emphasis on cockpit lighting, scanning, and night vision. The safest way to conduct flight at night is to have your eyes adapted to the dark. This is sometimes called dark adaptation in the aviation vernacular. Dark adaptation, during which vision becomes more sensitive to light, can be achieved to a moderate degree within 20 minutes under dim red cockpit lighting. After that, any exposure to white light, even for a few seconds, will seriously impair night vision. Only a very limited area of the eye has the ability to send clear messages to the brain. Only a small portion of the eye can see clear messages during the day. the visual acuity is at the center. But at night, the visual acuity is at the periphery. Effective scanning is done with a series of short, regularly spaced eye movements that bring successive areas of the sky into central viewing. Each movement should not exceed 10 degrees, and each area should be observed for at least 1 second to enable the eyes to detect a moving or contrasting object. Pilots should execute gentle banks at a frequency which permits continuous visual scanning of the airspace about them during climbs and descents in flight conditions which permit visual detection of other traffic.
Let's take time now for a review question on lighting and scanning. Which use of cockpit lighting is correct for night flight? Which use of cockpit lighting is correct for night flight? Correct answer is A, reducing the interior lighting intensity to a minimum level.
While operating VFR, pilots are only required to adhere to the basic altitude rules governing populated areas, sparsely populated areas, and so on, as well as the hemispherical rules that are based on course flown.
All right. Roger, why is it so important for you to know, for a pilot to know what airspace, what class of airspace they're in?
Well, one obvious example is that entering Class B airspace without the proper clearance can result in a nasty letter from the FAA or create serious and dangerous conditions for everyone. Now, as you learned, operating IFR places more of the communication burden back on the shoulders of ATC. They essentially guide you through the various airspace classes, providing the communications and clearances as you go. Now, you'll usually be operating in either Class E, D, C, or Class B airspace. Under these conditions, and on an IFR flight, you'll be in ATC contact anyway, and clearances will be given to you as needed. However, when operating VFR flight, you must consult your sectional charts and communicate with ATC to ensure that proper clearance requirements are met.
However, during IFR operations, additional requirements must be followed. In mountainous terrain, and while operating under IFR flight, pilots may not operate below 2,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal distance of 4 nautical miles from the course to be flown, except for takeoff or landing. During IFR operations in non-mountainous terrain, pilots may not operate below 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle. When operating in controlled airspace, pilots operating IFR should maintain the altitude assigned by ATC. However, if operating in VFR conditions on an on-top clearance, pilots should adhere to the hemispheric rule. For example, when flying eastbound on a magnetic course, the pilot should fly at odd thousands plus 500-foot altitudes, and when flying westbound on a magnetic course, the pilot must fly at even 1,000 feet plus 500 feet. When operating at or above 18,000 feet MSL, pilots must set their altimeter to 29.92 inches. However, pilots must hold an instrument rating. In congested areas, pilots must maintain a minimum altitude of 1,000-foot AGL within at least a 2,000-foot radius from the nearest structure. In non-congested areas, pilots must maintain a minimum altitude of 500-foot AGL within at least a 500-foot radius from the nearest structure. Over water or sparsely populated areas, there are no altitude restrictions within at least a 500-foot radius from the nearest object. Regardless of where you fly, you must maintain an altitude that allows you to land and not create a hazard to anyone or anything on the surface in the event of an engine failure. VFR cruising altitudes when flying between 180 to 359 degrees use altitudes of even thousandths plus 500 feet, i.e. 500 feet, 4,500 feet, 6,500 feet, and so on. When flying between 360 to 179 degrees, the altitudes of odd thousandths plus 500, i.e. 500 feet, 3,500, 5,500, and so on. This provides a 1,000-foot altitude separation between aircraft.
Moving along for another review question. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, or unless otherwise authorized by the administrator, the minimum altitude for IFR flight is. The minimum altitude for IFR flight. The correct answer here, C. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, no person may operate an aircraft under IFR below an altitude of 2,000 feet above the highest obstacle within 4 nautical miles for mountainous areas, and in any other case, 1,000 feet above. Correct answer there, C. All right, another topic. Communications, a favorite. Back to the classroom and your instructor.
From your VFR flying days, you might remember that it was possible to fly local and cross-country with little or no radio communications other than the occasional PIREP or pilot report. This all changes when the pilot operates IFR. The FAA and ATC wants the PIC of an aircraft operating under IFR in controlled airspace to report the following items as soon as possible. Any unforecast weather, the time and altitude passing each designated reporting point, including fixes used to define direct routes, except when you're in radar contact. Resume normal position reporting when you're advised radar contact lost or radar service is terminated. Any other information relating to the safety of flight. The pilot should also advise ATC immediately should any of the following malfunctions occur in flight. Loss of VOR or ADF capability. Complete or partial loss of ILS receiver capability, impairment of air-ground communication capability. Some additional reports should be made without specific request from ATC, and these include when approach has been missed, when leaving a previously assigned altitude for a newly assigned altitude, when you are unable to climb or descend at a rate of at least 500 feet per minute, changing altitude when operating VFR on top, change in average true airspeed of plus or minus 5% or 10 knots, whichever is greater, from that filed in the flight plan, time and altitude reaching a holding fix or clearance limit, leaving a holding. Additionally, when you're not in radar contact, a report should be made upon leaving the final approach fix inbound on final, and should a previously submitted estimate be made more than 3 minutes in error, a corrected estimate should be given to ATC.
Okay, one review question for you on communications. Which report should be made to ATC without a specific request when not in radar contact? Which report? Your correct answer here, B. You should make a report when leaving the final approach fix inbound on final approach and correct a previous estimate if it becomes apparent you will be in error in excess of 3 minutes. Correct answer B. Okay, next topic. Lost communications. Back to your classroom and your instructor for lost communications.
In the old days, communication equipment was not nearly as reliable as today. So many pilots actually experienced real lost communications. The good news, however, is that the airplane really does not care whether the radio works or not, and it keeps right on flying. The FAA again provides the requirements should you experience the rare lost communications. If unable to contact ATC on a newly assigned frequency, you should go back to the previous frequency. If contact is lost on that frequency also, you should attempt to establish contact with the nearest flight service station. If it becomes apparent that two-way radio communication has been lost, you should change your transponder code to 7600. If communications are lost in VFR conditions, remain VFR and land as soon as practicable. Should the communication failure occur in IFR conditions, proceed to the destination by route selection as follows. The route assigned in the last ATC clearance, or if being radar vectored, by the direct route to the fix, route, or airway specified in the vector clearance, or if no route has been assigned, by the route you were told to expect, or, in the absence of any of the above, by the route filed in the flight plan. Altitude-based lost communications are as follows. At the highest of the following altitudes for the route segment being flown, the altitude assigned in the last clearance received, or the altitude ATC is advised may be expected in a further clearance, or the minimum en route altitude, or MEA. If you're given holding instructions or a clearance limit, leave that fix at the expected further clearance, or EFC, time. If holding is necessary in the terminal area, it should be done as depicted, or if none is depicted, at the initial approach fix, or IAF. If no holding was required en route, you should proceed to the terminal area without delay and hold, maintaining the en route altitude. When holding or on a clearance limit, leave that fix at the expect further clearance, or EFC, time. If none is depicted, at the initial approach fix, or IAF. If no holding was required en route, proceed to the terminal area and hold, maintaining the en route altitude. Descent for approach may begin upon arrival at the IAF, but not before the ETA shown on the flight plan, as amended with ATC. If an expect approach clearance, or EAC, time has been received, begin descent for the approach at that time.
Have you ever experienced lost communications during your IFR flying?
Well, besides having the wrong frequency selected, the answer is yes, on several occasions. And I've learned from these instances each time. Now, I remember having experienced some radio trouble with an ancient Mark 12 early in the day. However, unwisely, I chose to depart IFR from Hanscom, Massachusetts for LaGuardia, New York, depending on just a handheld comm radio, for backup. Well, that was mistake number one. That little radio worked fine for departure. However, once outside the airport environment, I was unable to talk to the tower and the en route ATC facility. On top of that, I was in solid IMC conditions. So after I calmed down a little bit, lowered the landing gear to get some stability, I squawked 7600, and so I was barely able to get the frequency and approach instructions for the nearest ILS-equipped airport. Fortunately, my navigation radios and ILS portion still worked. That's the time I flew my best approach in my entire aviation career. So, after landing and kissing the ground, the local avionics shop could not find any malfunction with my communications radios. So what did I learn from this, Matt? Well, I learned Murphy's Law prevails, and not to depart with just a handheld radio and to replace my obsolete radios. The trip home was uneventful. I flew VFR, and yes, I replaced all the comm radios with brand new equipment.
Roger, excellent insights. Again, we appreciate your being in the studio with us today and talking about regulations and procedures. Our thanks.
Remember, while the rules may seem long, they're grounded in common sense and experience. When you're ready to take your knowledge exam, you might want to review any lessons where additional study can increase your confidence. Finally, it all comes down to don't hurt anyone and don't break anything. For ASA and STEMBOK Communications, this is Robert Bremer, and it has been my pleasure to be your instructor during this IFR course.
Okay, let's take a final review question for our final topic in this lesson. During an IFR flight in IMC, you enter a holding pattern at a fix that is not the same as the approach fix, with an EFC time of 1530. At 1520, you experience complete two-way communications failure. Which procedure should you follow to execute the approach to a landing? Which of these is correct? Your correct answer here is B. The approach may begin upon arrival at the IAF, but not before the ETA shown on the flight plan as amended with the ATC. Well, that wraps up our Lesson 5. Next up, Lesson 6 on departure procedures.